Walter stood by the window with the same solemn face as before and continued refusing to look directly at Gillen. After clearing his throat once, he spoke again in an oddly stiff voice, commenting on how nice the weather was. Ghislaine answered simply, but instead of moving to the point, Walter repeated himself and continued staring outside. The room became painfully awkward until Walter finally began muttering to himself about the northern fortress. One side of the fortress walls had collapsed some time ago, and repairs would cost around 5,000 gold. Yet immediately after bringing it up, he awkwardly dismissed his own words, acting as if he was merely talking to himself. Then he sighed dramatically and began lamenting the estate's poor finances, the upcoming campaign against the barbarians, and how everything ultimately reflected his own shortcomings as lord. At that point, Ghislaine finally realized what was happening. His father, the proud lord who would never openly ask for help, was indirectly asking for money. Suddenly, memories of his mother resurfaced. She used to laugh and say that Walter was incapable of directly asking for financial support because of his pride as a man. So instead, he would complain vaguely until someone understood and helped him. Back then, Ghislaine thought she was exaggerating, but now he was watching the exact scene unfold in front of him. Meanwhile, Walter was internally growing frustrated because he thought he had made the hints obvious enough and couldn't understand why his son still wasn't responding. To push things further without losing dignity, he sighed again and casually mentioned that if someone happened to make a donation or provide something like a development fund for the estate, it would certainly help. Ghislaine almost laughed at hearing that phrase again. It seemed the obsession with development funds truly ran in the family. After thinking briefly, he decided there was no reason to refuse. He had already planned to support the northern defenses eventually anyway, so he simply said that after selling the runestones, he would send 5,000 gold for the fortress repairs. Walter visibly reacted for a brief moment, but quickly recovered and pretended to reject the offer, saying there was no need to interfere with Ghislaine's important plans. Ghislaine insisted that he genuinely wanted to support him and that it wasn't a burden. Walter resisted a little longer out of pride before finally giving in and quietly accepting while pretending he was doing Ghislaine a favor. Internally, however, he was delighted. He felt proud that his son had grown and even thought that next time maybe he should just ask directly. Ghislaine left the office afterward feeling more mentally exhausted than after fighting monsters. Managing people and navigating pride felt more draining than battles in the Forest of Beasts. Meanwhile, Homern had chosen an entirely different strategy from the others. Unlike Randolph or Albert, he had no intention of begging Ghislaine directly because he knew Ghislaine too well. In Homern's view, once money entered the young lord's hands, simple persuasion would never work. So instead, he decided to target the people around Ghislaine. Since Belinda had raised and educated him from childhood, Homern assumed Ghislaine would have trouble refusing her requests. Confident in what he considered a masterpiece of political maneuvering, Homern visited Belinda while carrying an expensive golden brooch crafted by a famous artisan. Belinda was surprised because Homern had practically ignored her for years while blaming her for Ghislaine's terrible behavior. After exchanging polite words, Homern gifted her the brooch and carefully explained his real intention. He wanted Belinda to convince Ghislaine to let him manage the runestone money for the good of the estate. Belinda listened quietly and then politely refused. She said Ghislaine's money belonged to Ghislaine and she wouldn't interfere. Homern tried repeatedly to persuade her, emphasizing that it was for the estate, but she firmly rejected him each time. Frustrated, he reached out to take back the brooch only to discover he couldn't pull it from her hand. Belinda had unconsciously wrapped mana around it and was gripping it with absurd determination while apologizing sweetly and insisting she wanted to return it. Homern realized she had no intention of letting go and became internally furious. Since creating a scene over a gift would damage his reputation, he reluctantly retreated while concluding that now he understood exactly why Ghislaine had become this way. Teacher and student truly resembled each other. After losing both his gift and dignity, Homern immediately moved to Plan B and visited Fergus instead, believing the older caretaker might be easier to persuade. This time he brought a shriveled mandragora root as a valuable health supplement. However, the moment he entered Fergus's room, his plan collapsed. Beside Fergus's bed were piles of expensive medicinal herbs and nutrition supplements. Fergus happily explained that Ghislaine had already given him large quantities before leaving for the Forest of Beasts. Homern stared at his pathetic little route and then at Fergus's mountain of luxury supplies and instantly lost all fighting spirit. Quietly stuffing the root back into his pocket, he abandoned his plan and left while telling Fergus to simply stay healthy. Once again, the young lord had moved faster than everyone else. After forcing himself to rest for only 2 additional days, Ghislaine immediately resumed moving despite not being fully recovered. His body still hadn't returned to normal, but compared to the injuries he had suffered inside the blood python's mouth, simply being able to stand and travel already meant his recovery speed was abnormal. Once the mercenaries were gathered again, Gillian hesitated awkwardly and kept glancing behind Ghislaine. Turning around, Ghislaine quickly understood why. Belinda had appeared and was calmly walking over as if joining an ordinary outing. When Ghislaine jokingly asked whether she had come to see them off, Belinda immediately rejected the idea and declared that she was coming too. Ghislaine tried to stop her since her mana circulation had only recently stabilized and she still needed rest, but Belinda stubbornly insisted. She argued that traveling with a fortune like the runestones was dangerous, and she wouldn't be able to rest peacefully while imagining Ghislaine running around recklessly again. In the end, Ghislaine gave up resisting and only extracted a promise that she would speak up if her condition worsened. Instead of immediately leaving to sell the runestones, Ghislaine first led everyone back into the Forest of Beasts. Their goal wasn't more runestones. It was recovering everything they had left behind. This time the journey was much easier. The road had already been opened, there were horses, and the lingering presence of the blood python discouraged monster activity. They collected the remaining gyrosint inner bark and the rest of the blood python's enormous corpse. When Gillian asked whether they planned to mine additional runestones, Ghislaine refused outright. Time mattered more than profit now. He ordered the monster materials stored carefully back at the estate, the bark preserved intact, and the blood python separated into poison, blood, flesh, skin, and other useful components before decomposition began. The estate workers received detailed instructions, and before anyone could settle down again, Ghislaine immediately gathered everyone and left. The mercenaries complained jokingly that their employer acted like someone was chasing him. Yet because they knew selling runestones meant large rewards, most followed enthusiastically. Gillian alone remained worried and asked whether such urgency was necessary when Ghislaine had barely recovered. Ghislaine's answer stayed the same as before. Time was not on their side. He kept pushing the pace until even the wagons carrying the runestones struggled to keep up. The mercenaries gradually shifted from excitement to admiration because Ghislaine's horsemanship was extraordinary. Nobles learned riding as a basic skill, but Ghislaine rode with battlefield precision and natural mastery far beyond anything they had seen. The more they watched him, the harder it became to believe he was only a young noble. After several days of travel, however, confusion started spreading. They had already passed multiple major estates with wealthy merchant guilds. If the goal was simply to sell runestones, they should have gone to Raypold or another major northern trading center. Cor finally asked directly where they were heading. Ghislaine casually answered, Brevant Estate. That answer surprised everyone because Brevant wasn't famous for trade, it was famous for something else. Slowly, realization spread among the mercenaries. Ghislaine confirmed their suspicions. They weren't going to a merchant guild. They were heading to the Magic Tower. Once the purpose became clear, the mercenaries immediately understood the logic. Selling directly to mages meant cutting out merchants and getting a much better price because runestones were essential materials for magical research. Excitement returned instantly, but then Kyor brought up a reasonable objection. If they were going to a magic tower anyway, why choose the Crimson Flame Tower in Brevant? The strongest and wealthiest magical organization in the north now was the Scarlet Tower. It had more prestige, more purchasing power, and would almost certainly pay better. Several mercenaries assumed Ghislaine simply remembered incorrectly and tried correcting him. However, Ghislaine firmly rejected the suggestion. They were absolutely going to the Crimson Flame Tower. He didn't explain why and only said he had his reasons. Belinda quietly became irritated at how casually the mercenaries questioned him, even nudging Gillian to discipline them. But Ghislaine himself didn't care. The mercenaries had learned enough from the Forest of Beasts to stop arguing. Half trusted that Ghislaine was seeing something they couldn't. The other half decided it wasn't their problem as long as they got paid. Eventually, the tower appeared on the horizon and the group entered Brevant territory. At nearly the same time, elsewhere in the north, another person received the news. Count Harold Desmond stood inside his office reading intelligence reports from spies planted inside Ferdium. The reports stated clearly that Ghislaine had succeeded in obtaining enormous quantities of runestone. Harold's reaction wasn't excitement, it was frustration. His original strategy had been to slowly weaken Ferdium until swallowing it became effortless. Now that plan had been disrupted. He regretted not escalating matters sooner and wondered whether provoking direct conflict earlier would have been better. What troubled him most wasn't the runestone itself, it was Ghislaine. Harold had investigated the northern estates extensively and had concluded long ago that Ghislaine was irrelevant and incompetent. Yet now his name kept appearing in incidents connected to Frank's disappearance, suspicious movements, entering the Forest of Beasts and suddenly returning successful. Harold realized something important. His intelligence had been wrong. The Ghislaine described in old reports and the Ghislaine acting now were not the same person. Feeling uneasy, Harold immediately ordered all intelligence on the northern estates to be rebuilt from the beginning and instructed his new lieutenant to throw away previous assumptions. As the red evening light filled his room, Harold stared outside with growing discomfort, sensing that something had begun moving in the north. Harold did not react immediately with anger, but instead became deeply unsettled. Sitting alone as evening turned his office dark, he realized that the appearance of runestones changed everything he had planned. Up until now, weakening Ferdium slowly had been enough, because a poor estate without resources could never rise quickly. But runestones were different. They were wealth that could instantly become soldiers, supplies, fortifications, roads, influence, and stability. Even if Ferdium suffered damage from conflict, they could rebuild. If enough time passed, they would no longer be easy prey. That realization forced Harold to abandon years of careful strategy. Unable to decide alone, he immediately sent an urgent report to the duchy, informing them that Ferdium had opened part of the Forest of Beasts and secured runestones. The reply came back quickly and contained no hesitation. Destroy Ferdium completely, use Diggle to ignite a territorial war, and afterward allow the duchy to step in. Digald itself was disposable. Reading that order made Harold finally understand the hidden purpose behind years of strange instructions. Ferdium had never been preserved out of mercy. The true target had always been the Forest of Beasts. As long as nobody touched it, Ferdium was allowed to survive. But Ghislaine had entered it and changed the balance. Now the estate itself had become unnecessary. Even while understanding the order, Harold remained disturbed. He couldn't understand why the duchy was willing to take such risks. Their long-term goal required secrecy, and open territorial wars increased exposure. Yet they were willing to accelerate everything because of this. He chose not to question it further, and instead began acting. Advisors were gathered, spies reassigned, and plans rewritten. Agents inside Ferdium would move to Digald and spread accusations that Gilmore's death had been caused by Ferdium, forcing conflict between the two territories. Digald alone wouldn't be enough to erase Ferdium, so Harold ordered hidden support disguised as mercenaries and conscripts. To ensure success, he even deployed Victor, his strongest hidden knight and one of his most valuable pieces. The strategists accepted the plan confidently and believed victory was guaranteed. Harold alone remained uneasy. Every calculation kept circling back to one person whose existence no longer matched any previous information. Ghislaine Ferdium. A useless heir was not supposed to create this much disruption. At the same time, far away from those decisions, Amelia was enjoying what she believed was the aftermath of her victory. She spent the afternoon elegantly drinking tea while petting Bastet and listening to Bernard praise her strategy. In her mind, everything had gone perfectly. She had manipulated information, severed Raypold's support, and cornered Ferdium financially. Ghislaine should have already been blamed and punished, perhaps imprisoned. Once isolated, killing him would become easy. She felt genuine satisfaction imagining him finally crushed beneath consequences. Bernarf praised her for using intelligence instead of force, and admired how she had turned her own weakness into a trap that ruined both Ghislaine and Ferdium at once. Amelia enjoyed the moment, casually ordering Bernarf to ensure Ghislaine and Belinda were both eliminated properly once the opportunity appeared. Then news from Ferdium arrived. Expecting confirmation of Ghislaine's downfall, Amelia opened the report calmly, but as she read, the expression vanished from her face. Her fingers tightened. The paper crumpled. The room itself seemed colder. Bernarf sensed danger immediately. Amelia slowly stood up, knocking the tea table and spilling everything onto the floor. She didn't answer his questions and simply threw the report at him. When he read it, even he froze. Ghislaine had succeeded. He had discovered runestones. Not only had Ferdium not collapsed, but the estate was celebrating him as a hero. Even worse, the expedition had been funded using the exact 20,000 gold she'd been forced to hand over. That detail destroyed her composure. To Amelia, this wasn't money, it was humiliation. She had been manipulated, threatened, and unknowingly turned into the investor behind Ghislaine's success. The man she wanted ruined had become stronger using her own wealth. Rage replaced elegance entirely. She repeatedly cursed Ghislaine's name, unable to contain herself. Bernarf remained silent because he knew her well enough to understand this wasn't ordinary anger anymore. Amelia rarely lost control even while arranging deaths, but Ghislaine had become an obsession. She immediately ordered Bernarf to gather everyone available, the wildcats, nearby bandits, every usable force. Her thinking became simple. Ghislaine had runestones. Runestones had to be transported. Therefore, they would attack the transport, kill everyone, and seize everything. Bernarf warned her that security would be heavy and that planning mattered, but she no longer cared. The only thing she wanted was Ghislaine dead and the runestones taken. After several days of relentless travel, Ghislaine's group finally reached the southern edge of Brabant Estate and arrived before the famous Crimson Flame Tower. The moment the mercenaries saw it, their entire mood changed. Up until now, they had been traveling with excitement because they believed they were about to turn runestones into enormous wealth. But the sight before them completely overwhelmed even that anticipation. Rising above the city stood an enormous tower so tall and extravagant that it seemed less like a building and more like something built to challenge the sky itself. Around it spread a vast city filled with elegant roads, luxurious buildings, orderly markets, and endless streams of well-dressed people. Though the Crimson Flame Tower had lost its title as the strongest tower in the north to the Scarlet Tower, its influence remained immense. What had begun as shops serving mages had gradually expanded into a prosperous city whose security and growth depended heavily on the tower. Even the Count of Brivant had to carefully maintain relations with the tower master. The mercenaries stared in disbelief. Compared to the harsh northern lands they came from, this place looked like another world entirely. Even Raypold, which they considered wealthy, felt ordinary in comparison. The roads were spotless, the buildings polished, and the people moved confidently without fear. Ghislaine quietly observed everything with interest rather than excitement. What impressed him wasn't simply the wealth, but the order. Even groups of armed mercenaries wandering through the streets didn't cause panic among citizens. People glanced at them, but continued walking normally. That level of calm meant security was excellent and public confidence was unusually high. During his years as king of mercenaries, Ghislaine had visited many cities built around magic towers across different nations, yet few matched this level of refinement. He wondered whether the tower master himself was obsessed with cleanliness or had personally invested effort into urban development. Either way, Ghislaine mentally noted countless details. One day, Ferdium would need to grow, and this city offered ideas worth stealing. Meanwhile, the mercenaries gradually became uncomfortable. Their rough clothes, scarred faces, and dirty equipment suddenly stood out. Citizens quietly whispered as they passed. Some commented that northerners looked uncivilized. Others wondered if they smelled. A few pitied them openly. Normally, such insults would end badly for anyone speaking near mercenaries, but the atmosphere of the city itself made them hesitate. For the first time in a long while, they felt like outsiders. One hot-headed member of the Cerberus mercenary corps finally snapped and partially drew his weapon while shouting at nearby people, But instead of fear, the citizens only looked amused and mildly inconvenienced. That reaction irritated the mercenaries even more. Before things escalated, Ghislain stepped in and stopped them immediately. Rather than being offended, he laughed and admitted they did look like country bumpkins. He told them to stop caring and enjoy the scenery instead. Kayor reinforced the order from behind, and although frustrated, the mercenaries obeyed. Eventually, the group reached the entrance of the Crimson Flame Tower itself. The tower was even larger up close, so enormous that it couldn't be taken in at once. Watching the mercenaries stare upward with open mouths, Ghislain silently shook his head. At the entrance stood the gatekeeper, who immediately formed an opinion after seeing their appearance. At first he assumed they were tourists because nobles sometimes visited the tower, but as they approached and he saw their worn clothes and numerous wagons, he changed his judgment. To him, they looked like a shabby group of mercenaries trying to sell low-quality monster materials. The gatekeeper wasn't important himself, but working for the tower made him act as though the prestige belonged to him personally. He decided before speaking that the tower wouldn't buy anything. When Ghislain dismounted and prepared to step forward, Belinda immediately stopped him. She insisted that Jillian should speak instead, because a young lord shouldn't negotiate personally from the beginning. Jillian stepped forward and attempted to introduce Ghislain properly, but the gatekeeper interrupted immediately and declared they wouldn't buy anything. He dismissed them before even hearing the offer. His attitude annoyed Jillian, but Ghislain remained calm. He understood the situation. Back when he was king of mercenaries, nobody dared judge him because his banner announced who he was before he spoke. Now he was just another poorly dressed noble from an unknown estate. Ghislain attempted one direct approach and requested to meet whoever handled transactions, or even the tower master directly. That only made the gatekeeper more arrogant. He scoffed and explained that not even local lords met the tower master freely. Jillian's patience finally broke, and he threatened the man openly, causing the gatekeeper to recoil briefly before regaining confidence behind the authority of the tower. He shouted for them to leave. Seeing that wasting words would achieve nothing, Ghislain quietly signaled Kayor. Without attracting attention, Kayor retrieved a small piece of runestone from one of the wagons and handed it over. Ghislain then held it directly in front of the gatekeeper and casually explained that this was what they came to sell. The gatekeeper took the stone absent-mindedly and examined it. Then his expression changed. At first came confusion, then realization, then complete panic. Runestone. Even if he didn't know how much they carried, one genuine piece was enough to understand the disaster he had nearly caused. The Crimson Flame Tower had been struggling to recover prestige after falling behind the Scarlet Tower. If it became known that he turned away visitors carrying runestones, he wouldn't just lose his position, he might lose his future entirely. Immediately his attitude flipped. His arrogance disappeared. His voice became polite. He invited them inside so quickly it was almost comical. As Ghislain passed by, he lightly patted the man's shoulder and smiled. He told him not to worry and added that he would make sure to tell the tower master what an excellent job the gatekeeper had done. The gatekeeper nearly collapsed. He couldn't tell whether that was praise or a threat. The mercenaries who entered the tower's lobby immediately slowed their steps without even realizing it. The moment they crossed the entrance, it felt as though they had entered a different world entirely. The spacious interior stretched out with polished floors so clean they reflected light like calm water. Decorative plants unlike anything they had seen in the northern estates stood neatly arranged in elegant pots, and expensive statues carved from marble and enchanted stone were displayed throughout the hall. Rather than a place for scholars buried in dusty books, the lobby looked more like the grand reception chamber of some absurdly wealthy royal palace. The mercenaries stared around with unconcealed amazement. Damn, this place is ridiculous. So mages live like this? Look at that statue. That thing alone probably costs more than our entire camp. Even Kayor looked around for a moment before regaining his composure. Watching this scene unfold, Sylvan, the apprentice mage assigned to guard the lobby, narrowed his eyes. Disk, what's with this crowd? Did a bunch of beggars wander in? His expression twisted. It wasn't because Sylvain had originally been arrogant. When he first entered the Crimson Flame Tower years ago, he had been a normal apprentice from an ordinary household. But people adapt to their surroundings. Years spent among proud mages who treated nobles casually and looked down on ordinary people, had slowly changed him. Now, whenever he saw poorly dressed travelers or mercenaries, irritation surfaced instinctively. His eyes swept over Gizlan's group. Their cloaks were worn, their boots carried road dust. Several had weapons openly strapped at their waists. To Sylvain, they looked less like customers and more like armed wanderers. Did the gatekeeper panic and let them in because there were too many of them? After all, the gatekeeper wasn't a mage. Against a large group carrying swords, even refusing entry would be difficult. Sylvain let out a disappointed sigh. Looks like I'll have to deal with this myself. Lifting his chin slightly, he walked forward with practiced arrogance. But before he reached them, the gatekeeper suddenly rushed over with a pale face. Sylvain clicked his tongue. Tisk, tisk. I told you not to let random people inside. You got frightened because there were too many of them, and now you're embarrassing the dignity of the greatest Crimson Flame Tower in the north? Before he finished speaking, the gatekeeper leaned close and whispered quickly into his ear. Sylvain's expression immediately changed. His eyes narrowed. He glanced at the carts outside, then at Gizlan, then back at the gatekeeper. His posture instantly straightened, and in the next moment he bowed. Not casually, not politely. A perfect right-angle bow. We are honored by your visit. May I ask where you have come from? The mercenaries blinked. Even Belinda stared. The change had happened so quickly it felt unnatural. Gizlan answered calmly. Gizlan Ferdium, young lord of Ferdium? Sylvain's face brightened instantly. Ah, so you are the young lord of Ferdium. I have long admired the noble and courageous reputation of Ferdium. The moment I saw you, I knew you weren't ordinary. It seems my judgment was correct. In reality, Sylvain had absolutely no idea where Ferdium was. He only understood one thing: noble, large cargo, rune stones. That combination meant danger if mishandled, so flattery was the safest path. Gizlan recognized the performance immediately, but rather than mocking him, he simply smiled faintly. This kind of behavior existed everywhere. Money changed expressions faster than magic. Gizlan spoke directly. I came to sell runestones. We brought a considerable quantity. I'd like to meet someone who can approve transactions of this scale, preferably your tower master. Sylvain's expression became even more respectful. Understood. Please wait only a short while. I will send word immediately. He personally escorted everyone to a reception room. The furniture inside looked expensive enough to make the mercenaries afraid to sit. After closing the doors behind them, Sylvain turned to the maids with an unusually serious expression. Treat them carefully. I mean it. Tea, food, make sure they are comfortable. If they complain about anything, report to me immediately. The maids looked confused. Sylvain never acted like this, but they nodded anyway. Without wasting another second, Sylvain hurried toward the upper floors. His heartbeat became faster the more he thought. More than 10 carts. If they really contained runestones, that wasn't a normal transaction. Even during the tower's golden age, merchant guilds rarely brought that volume. Normally, someone like him would never meet the tower master directly. But there was no time for hierarchy. If these guests became offended and left, the responsibility would fall entirely on him. I can survive getting scolded, but losing this deal, I'll get burned alive. Meanwhile, at the very top floor of the tower, a heavy atmosphere filled the conference room. The runestones are running out. The speaker was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an overly elegant mustache. His expression looked miserable. An elderly mage stroked his long white beard. That is correct. If this continues, the gap between us and the Scarlet Tower will only grow. The man sighed deeply. Ha! How did things end up like this? This man was Hubert, Tower Master of the Crimson Flame Tower, a sixth-circle mage. Though he had already passed 60 years of age, his mana allowed him to preserve a youthful appearance. Combined with his obsession with appearance and grooming, he looked younger than most men his age, at least until recently. Now wrinkles had begun appearing rapidly. Hubert looked around the room. Is there really no solution? 5 elders sat in silence. Nobody answered. Hubert became irritated. No, Nobody has anything. We used to stand above them. Above them. Are you telling me none of you feel humiliated? The elders exchanged subtle glances. Their thoughts remained unspoken. Maybe if someone spent less time attending noble banquets and more time training. The Scarlet Tower has a seventh circle archmage. What exactly are we competing with? Luxury all day and panic later. Mages were highly individualistic, which meant they were experts at assigning blame. The elders blamed Hubert. Hubert blamed the elders. Nobody blamed themselves. Eventually, one elder spoke. We must improve our magical capabilities and prove once again who truly rules Northern fire magic. Hubert immediately snapped back. And with what? Empty hands? Silence returned. Magic wasn't simple. To develop spells, mages interpreted formulas, imposed will upon mana, and forced reality to obey. Failure could cripple a body or kill instantly. Runestones absorbed instability. Without them, training slowed, research stopped, advancement stalled. If runestones disappear, we cannot even train properly. It's true. And are we beggars? Why should great mages train with bare bodies like poor wanderers? Another elder muttered quietly. The Scarlet Tower Master supposedly trained like that, Hubert exploded. Stop bringing up Delmud. His chair nearly tipped over. How do you know that story is even true? If I had enough runestones, I'd already be 7th Circle too. The elders lowered their heads. Privately, they disagreed. Still, nobody argued. Another elder tried changing topics. The merchant guilds say there's no stock. Even when we match prices, they refuse. Supply is disappearing. Hubert rubbed both cheeks. How is artifact production? A bitter answer came. It's slowing. That answer hurt most. Artifacts and scrolls funded everything. Without runestones, income collapsed. Research collapsed. Eventually, the tower itself collapsed. The room grew quiet. Then knock, knock, knock. Hubert frowned. We're in a meeting. Knock, knock, knock. His forehead twitched. I said come back later. Knock, knock, knock. Hubert stood up, grinding his teeth. Whoever it is, I'll burn their head. Then the door burst open. Bang! A trembling apprentice stepped inside. Hubert glared. Who are you? Who let you in? Put your head down. I'll burn every strand of hair off. The apprentice swallowed. Hubert didn't even recognize him. Sylvan gathered courage. There's someone here. Hubert narrowed his eyes. What? Sylvan took another breath. They came to sell runestones. The room froze. Hubert slowly leaned forward. The elders straightened. The atmosphere changed instantly. Sylvain forced the words out. It's not a normal amount. His throat tightened. There are more than 10 carts. Everyone stared. Sylvain finished. And they appear to be completely loaded with runestones. For a moment, nobody moved. Then every elder and the Tower Master jumped to their feet at the same time. The proud Tower Master Hubert and his 5 elders hurriedly descended to the lobby to meet Ghislain Ferdium, though Hubert feigned a leisurely pace to maintain a shred of his dignity as a high-ranking 6th Circle mage. Upon arrival, Hubert was deeply unsettled by Ghislain's entourage, which consisted of vulgar, rough-looking mercenaries rather than a standard noble guard. Despite the mage's initial suspicion that they were dealing with bandits or scammers due to the group's shabby and crude appearance, Ghislain introduced himself politely as the young lord of the impoverished Ferdium estate. Hubert and the elders tried to lowball the transaction by putting on a clumsy, transparent act, loudly complaining that the massive pile of runestones was underwhelming in both quantity and quality. The seasoned mercenaries easily saw through the performance, whispering mockingly about the mage's obvious greed. The group was then transported via a magic circle to a lavish reception room on the top floor, where the elders tried to assert dominance by boasting of their titles and insulting Ghislain's poor estate. Ghislain, however, held hidden knowledge from a past life. He knew the Crimson Flame Tower was desperately stuck in 2nd place behind the rival Scarlet Tower and was in a state of growing crisis. Weaponizing this leverage, Ghislain subtly mocked their 2nd place status and completely disrupted the negotiations. When Hubert aggressively demanded a low price, and threatened him against overcharging, Ghislaine calmly demanded double the market price. As the mages erupted in fury, Ghislaine seamlessly raised the price to 2.5 times and finally to 3 times the market price, silencing the room in utter shock. Ghislaine's companions, particularly Belinda, grew worried that his reckless haggling would ruin the deal. But Ghislaine abruptly stood up and walked toward the door, threatening to take his massive supply of runestones straight to their rivals at the Scarlet Tower. Terrified of losing the stones, Hubert abandoned his pride, rushed to block the door, and begged Ghislaine to stay and negotiate. Returning gracefully to his seat with the upper hand completely secured, Ghislaine left the cornered, anxious mages with the final, pressing question of whether they would buy everything for 3 times the price. The proud Tower Master Hubert and his 5 elders quickly found themselves entirely outmatched in the negotiation. Realizing none of them possessed the commercial wit to handle Ghislaine Ferdium, Hubert desperately attempted to compromise by offering double the market price. But Ghislaine immediately stood up to leave, forcing the panicked Tower Master to quickly backtrack. Cornered by the threat of losing the invaluable materials to their rivals at the Scarlet Tower, Hubert eventually gave in and agreed to the staggering demand of triple the market price. While Ghislaine's companions Belinda, Jillian, and Kayor watched in absolute shock at the success of this ruthless demand, Ghislaine remained completely unfazed, privately knowing that impending distribution blockades by the Scarlet Tower would soon make these runestones impossible to acquire at any price. Before the transaction could conclude, Ghislaine pushed his advantage even further by demanding that 10 Third Circle combat mages be dispatched to the Ferdium estate for a year as a free bonus, included in the triple price rate. This outrageous condition, coupled with Ghislaine's blunt admission that he intended to secretly deploy these mages in an illegal estate war, pushed the mages past their breaking point. Outraged by the violation of kingdom law and the blatant insult to their pride, Hubert and the elders unleashed an overwhelming surge of mana, causing the room to tremble violently. As a deadly confrontation loomed, Jillian prepared to shield Ghislaine with his life. Kayor subtly lowered his stance to assassinate Hubert at the first sign of an attack, and a terrified Belinda prepared to use Kayor as a human shield to escape with the young lord. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, Ghislaine effortlessly shattered their resolve by revealing that his estate sat on a massive deposit containing over 10 times the amount of runestones they had seen today. He masterfully tempted them with the promise of a future monopoly contract that would easily elevate the Crimson Flame Tower above the Scarlet Tower to become the greatest magic tower in the entire kingdom. The irresistible allure of a stable supply completely deflated the mages' hostility and pride. When Ghislaine feigned offense at their intimidation tactics and threatened to take his business elsewhere, Hubert and the elders immediately abandoned their anger, clumsily pretending the terrifying display of mana had merely been a test of his trustworthiness. Ultimately, a thoroughly defeated Hubert could only nod weakly in acceptance, completely submitting to the terms and asking to hear more about the estate war. Belinda, Jillian, and Kayor watched in utter bewilderment as the mages instantly shifted back to a servile attitude the moment Ghislaine offered a steady supply of runestones, completely unaware that Ghislaine's successful manipulation was driven by his secret regression and knowledge of the future. While Belinda practical-mindedly wondered if she could exploit the situation for a greater advantage, Ghislaine navigated Hubert's questions about the impending war by framing it as a necessary defense. He pragmatically explained that a weak estate like Ferdium would inevitably face aggressive neighbors trying to steal their newfound wealth, hiding the fact that he already knew the powerful Delphine Duchy would be the true invader. Driven entirely by his desperation to secure the runestones and crush the rival Scarlet Tower, Hubert convinced his hesitant elders to accept the risk. Believing they were safeguarding their own future, the mages agreed to secretly lend their strength to Ferdium, completely oblivious to the fact that the Scarlet Tower had already laid a trap to destroy them and that Ghislaine was actually throwing them a lifeline. 4 days later, a visibly exhausted Hubert met Ghislaine to admit that due to the extreme individualism of mages and the strict need for secrecy, they could only gather 6 trustworthy Third Circle masters instead of the requested 10. When Ghislaine threatened to cancel the deal, the desperate mages began to wail and plead, prompting Ghislaine to offer an alternative condition: the permanent transfer of a personal mage. Hubert reluctantly agreed to consult the candidate, only for Ghislaine to immediately name Vanessa. The mages initially drew a blank before realizing he was referring to a supposedly untalented, freeloading apprentice who had been relegated to working as a maid after her mentor's death. Inwardly mocking Ghislaine for being a naive novice who had likely fallen for her looks, Hubert and the elders ecstatically finalized the deal and rushed to fetch the apprentices, completely unaware that Ghislaine was smiling triumphantly after securing the most crucial piece of his master plan. As soon as the mages left the room, Jillian asked Ghislaine why he wanted a personal mage. Based on what the elder had said, this woman seemed completely untalented and was only used for basic chores. Ghislaine simply replied that it all depended on how you used a person, silencing Jillian's doubts. Meanwhile, Cor was highly suspicious of the deal, finding it absurd to accept a maid in place of 4 powerful mages. But he chose not to pry. Instead, Kaer suggested that announcing they had hired mages could scare away potential enemies. Ghislaine rejected the idea, knowing the powerful Delphine Duchy would attack their family regardless. To win, the Ferdium family needed to hide their true strength, so Ghislaine ordered everyone to keep the mages a secret. Soon, Hubert and the elders returned with the group. 6 of the mages wore splendid robes and looked highly confident. Behind them stood a woman in her early 20s with tangled dark red hair and a torn, dirty robe. She looked incredibly anxious from years of mistreatment. Hubert proudly introduced the group, highlighted by Elfoy, his star disciple, and the tower's future successor. Though Elfoy spoke politely, his face showed clear arrogance. Ghislaine immediately shattered Elfoy's pride by speaking down to him like a servant. Though Elfoy felt deeply humiliated, he hid his rage and bowed his head, vowing to endure the disrespect for the 1-year contract. Next, an elder harshly shoved the nervous woman forward, calling her a useless freeloader. Terrified, she introduced herself as Vanessa. When Ghislaine warmly greeted her, she confessed that no one had told her she was being sent away. Shocked to find herself suddenly discarded by the tower, Vanessa tried to protest, but Hubert and the elders aggressively shouted her down. They hid the fact that she could not use magic, pressured her to repay the tower for raising her, and threatened to ban her from magic forever if she refused. Vanessa burst into tears. She had mastered all the theory but could not hold mana in her body. She knew that leaving the tower meant losing her only chance to study magic and becoming a mere servant for a noble. Seeing her cry, Ghislaine stepped in and told the mages to stop being so harsh. He gently patted Vanessa's shoulder, looked into her eyes with the warmth of an old friend, and genuinely asked her to be his mage. When a trembling Vanessa asked if she could just stay at the tower, Ghislaine dropped his smile. He looked at her firmly and warned her that if she chose to stay behind, she would die. The mages clicked their tongues inwardly, thinking Ghislaine was a crazy and unusual bastard, while his own companions were shocked that he would coldly threaten a terrified woman. Ghislaine told Vanessa that since the tower had already handed her over, she would not survive if she stayed behind, which deeply scared her into submission. Once Vanessa tearfully agreed to serve him, Ghislaine instantly switched back to a gentle smile, leaving everyone utterly confused by his rapid mood swings. In reality, Ghislaine knew from his past life that Vanessa was a failed genius who had been completely ignored by the blind mages of the tower. He had traveled all this way specifically to recruit her as his ultimate weapon, knowing that leaving her at the tower would eventually lead to a dark and miserable future. In his past life, during a time of global chaos, Ghislaine's mercenary subordinates had told him about the Red Nightmare, a crazy 7th Circle arsonist named Vanessa, who was turning the northern region into a sea of fire. She had mastered an incorrect mana breathing method on her own because she could not hold mana through normal magic circles, which eventually drove her insane. Intrigued by her raw talent, Ghislaine personally went to track her down in the mountains, where she attacked him like a wild animal with massive fire spells. He easily dodged her attacks, pinned her down, and forced his own mana into her body to temporarily restore her sanity. Unfortunately, her magic core was already completely shattered from the unstable breathing technique. As she lay dying and coughing up blood, Vanessa bitterly regretted that her simple love for magic had turned her into a mass murderer. while Ghislaine bluntly joked that she should have joined his mercenary group sooner so he could have fixed her. Before taking her last breath, Vanessa whispered that being a mercenary sounded fun, and Ghislaine burned her body as a final sign of respect. Back in the present day, Ghislaine smiled secretly, proud that he had stepped in early to change her tragic fate and secure his most valuable asset.